Please be aware that several images below depict the bodies of those murdered in the massacre. During the early 20th century, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was known as the Negro Wall Street of America because of its prosperous black business community. In 1921, Greenwood was home to nearly 11,000 black people, 1/10 of Tulsa's overall population, and spanned a 35-block area. The district boasted close to 200 businesses, including 31 restaurants, more than 24 grocery stores, 5 hotels, 4 drugstores, and 2 theaters. There were a dozen churches, as well as 2 schools, 2 hospitals, 2 newspapers, and a public library. Most of the businesses and residential properties were owned by black Tulsans. The black professional class comprised not only clergy and teachers but also 3 lawyers, including the pioneering Buck Colbert Franklin, 15 doctors, one of whom was a nationally acclaimed surgeon, Dr. A. C. Jackson, and enterprising businessmen such as Greenwood's founder, O. W. Gurley. Remarkably, the neighborhood's affluence occurred at a time when most black Southerners lived in rural areas and toiled as sharecroppers on white-owned plantations. For all these reasons, the Greenwood district was not just a wealthy black community in the age of segregation, it was, and remains, a potent symbol of black excellence. The eruption of white mob violence in downtown Tulsa on May 31, 1921, interrupted Greenwood's historic ascendancy. What has come to be known as the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre was instigated by speculation that 19-year-old Dick Rowland, who was black, had attacked Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white elevator operator. While it is unclear precisely what occurred during the brief interaction between the two in an elevator in Tulsa's downtown business district on May 30, we know that Page screamed and Rowland fled the elevator in a panic. There is no record of what Page told bystanders or the police who interviewed her following the incident, but police authorities were left with the impression that Rowland had attacked her. The following afternoon, on May 31, the Tulsa Tribune published an incendiary article, "Nabbed Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator," which asserted that Rowland had indeed assaulted Page. As was common for the era, the Tribune insinuated that he had attempted to rape her. Word began to spread about the alleged attack, and by evening a large number of whites had begun to gather in front of the Tulsa County Courthouse, where Rowland was being held in the county jail. It quickly became clear that some among the crowd intended to lynch him. Fearing that the lynching of Dick Rowland was imminent, a small, armed contingent of black men, some of whom had served in World War I, came to the courthouse around 9 p.m. to offer the authorities their assistance. They left upon being promised that no harm would come to Rowland, but their brief presence further enraged the growing white mob. By 9:30 there were almost 2,000 angry whites milling around outside the courthouse, many with guns, and the county sheriff was preparing his deputies to make a stand should the building be attacked. When a second, larger group of black men arrived in hopes of helping to protect Rowland, they were again told that their services were not needed. This time, however, a white bystander, perhaps angered by the sight of black men carrying weapons, attempted to take the gun of a black veteran who was walking away with the rest of the group. As the men struggled, one of their guns went off. In the chaos of the moment, armed whites began shooting indiscriminately at the retreating black men, some of whom shot back. In that first quick interchange of gunfire, 20 people were killed or wounded. The black men hastily left the scene, but they were followed by armed whites, who engaged them in further gunfire on 4th Street and then on Cincinnati Avenue, resulting in additional casualties. That initial pursuit ended when what was left of the group of black men made it across the tracks of the St. Louis-San Francisco Railway, popularly known as the Frisco Railroad, the demarcation line between white Tulsa and black Tulsa. Believing that the armed blacks had instigated the firefight, Tulsa authorities joined forces with the enraged white civilians who had been at the courthouse, and together they set out to put down the Negro uprising. Tulsa police haphazardly appointed between 250 and 500 white men, and even white youth, as special deputies, granting them the authority to arrest as well as shoot and kill black people whom they viewed as in rebellion against white Tulsans. According to one eyewitness and participant in the massacre, the deputized whites were specifically told to get a gun and get a nigger. when a group of black men gathered north of the Frisco tracks, forming a defensive wall to prevent the swelling white mob from crossing en masse into Black Tulsa. They were violently confronted around midnight by the Tulsa police, the local unit of the Oklahoma National Guard, and the hastily assembled contingent of armed deputies. Whites who had already made it into the black community were now shooting randomly through windows and setting homes and businesses on fire. In at least a few cases, blacks were deliberately murdered, including an elderly couple who were gunned down inside their home. The most destructive and perhaps deadliest race massacre in American history had begun, and it would continue unabated for approximately 12 hours. By noon on June 1, by one contemporaneous estimate, as many as 300 people had been killed, and Greenwood's business district, as well as more than 1,000 black residences, lay in ashes. The vast majority of contemporaneous press coverage, official reports, and subsequent histories refer to the events of May 31 and June 1, 1921, as the Tulsa Race Riot. To be sure, since the middle of the 19th century, race riot has been the generic term used to describe outbreaks of violence between different racial or ethnic groups. In the past 5 years, however, there has been a growing consensus within the news media and the general public around race massacre as the more appropriate descriptor, which is part of a larger effort to tell the story of what occurred from the vantage point of the black victims and survivors. The Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, 2015 present, headed by Oklahoma State Senator Kevin Matthews, is to be applauded for its leadership in initiating the conversation about how the events can be most accurately framed. I believe the shift in terminology from race riot to race massacre is a necessary and timely corrective. First and foremost, the word massacre better captures what actually occurred. Had the black community been able to keep the white invaders from entering the Greenwood district, or had the violence subsided that same night, the term riot might be more apt. The following morning, however, white civilians and authorities banded together to launch a systematic assault on black people and property, and that coordinated incursion places the subsequent events squarely in the realm of a massacre. According to testimony from both black and white eyewitnesses, by daybreak on June 1, several thousand armed whites had amassed in various locations along the southern border of the Greenwood district. At approximately 5 a.m., a whistle or siren was sounded as a signal for the invasion to begin. As the white mob stormed into Greenwood, a machine gun that had been set up atop a grain elevator sprayed bullets into black homes, businesses, and churches along Greenwood Avenue. Airplanes flew overhead, from which whites reportedly fired pistols and shotguns, and even dropped rudimentary explosives, down at blacks fleeing the violence. Once in Greenwood, the invading whites, civilians as well as authorities, reportedly shot and killed any black person who was found to be armed or who did not immediately surrender, including some who were simply attempting to flee from the violence. Faced with this overwhelming show of force, black Tulsans reluctantly emerged from their homes, surrendered whatever weapons they possessed, and were taken into custody. They were transported to temporary detention centers, at Convention Hall until it was full, and then to McNulty Park and the fairgrounds, where they were held until they were able to get a white person to vouch for them. There is no evidence that any of the whites involved in the mob violence were detained by authorities, let alone arrested. Some buildings in Greenwood had already been set ablaze during the nighttime fighting, but whites now systematically looted homes, churches, and businesses and then set them on fire. After some 12 hours of continuous mob violence, almost every significant structure within the 35-block area had been burned to the ground or severely damaged. The invasion of the Greenwood district, in other words, was a far cry from a race riot or merely an outbreak of violence between two different racial or ethnic groups. It was an intentional military-style assault on a civilian community. The financial losses were staggering, totaling approximately $2 million, $26 million in today's dollars, of black wealth. White-owned stores that had been looted by whites seeking guns and ammunition during the massacre later received restitution, but even though insurance companies and the city of Tulsa initially promised to recompense black business owners and black residents who had lost everything, they never made good on such reparations. Furthermore, Tulsa area banks and lending institutions refused to provide loans to black businesses and homeowners seeking to rebuild. In retrospect, the actions of the white mob and local authorities can only be interpreted as a concerted attempt to expel Tulsa's black community, as had happened elsewhere in the region. Seemingly underlining this point, a photo of Greenwood engulfed in heavy smoke is captioned running, "Sick, the Negro out of Tulsa." Despite the best efforts of the white mob and the city's leaders, black Tulsans rebuilt the Greenwood district brick by brick. By 1942, according to attorney and historian Hannibal Johnson, the district had reached its zenith, with more than 242 black-owned and black-operated businesses. In the final analysis, an important legacy of the Tulsa Race Massacre has proven to be the grit and resilience of the black survivors.